Good afternoon, and welcome to the latest lecture of the World War II Discussion Forum Summer Series. I'm Greg McNiff and the Executive Director of the group. Before I introduce this afternoon's speakers, I want to briefly cover the usual housekeeping items. First, our speakers have graciously agreed to take questions after their prepared remarks. As always, you have two ways to ask your question. You can either use the raised hand feature at the bottom of the screen, and I will call on you to unmute your line, or you can type your question in the chat or Q&A box, and I will read out your question to our speakers. Regardless of the method, please be respectful in terms of time and the substance of the question. Second, donations are always appreciated but never expected. Please note there's a donate tab on the website. Third, as I indicated, we will be recording this talk for our social media channel. It'll be published and uploaded shortly thereafter on YouTube, and you can access the channel through the website. And fourth and finally, you can send any feedback through the website at wwiidf.org. Now, this afternoon's speakers, and I say plural because we're fortunate enough to have both of the authors here today, so I want to thank them for accommodating us. Uh, I'll introduce Professor Raymond Callahan. His interest is in the Indian Army of the British Raj, was kindled by reading John Master's uh, Bulges and A Tiger as a teenager. He has his PhD from Harvard. He has written, I think, 9 books now and numerous articles on the subject, including the Burma campaign and the transformation of the British Indian Army, which won the Templar Medal Prize. He is Professor Emeritus at History at the University of Delaware, a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, and a series editor of Hellion's War and Military Culture in South Asia. He is joined by his co-author, Dr. Alan Jeffries, who is the head of collections and research at the National Army Museum and a visiting professor at the University of Greenwich. He is also the series editor of Hellion's War and Military Culture in South Asia and a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. Today, they're going to discuss their joint book, Churchill's Forgotten Generals, Victors in Burma, which discusses the crucial roles of General Auchinleck, Slim, and Savory in the campaigns in Northeast India and Burma. The book was published by Hellion Press in September of 2025, and it's an absolutely great read from two very knowledgeable sources. I'm going to turn it over to them now, and thank you both for joining us today.
Well, good afternoon to everyone. I wrote chapters on Claude Auchinleck and William Slim, Bill Slim, and I want to underline just a couple of things in brief remarks this afternoon. The first is that it is difficult, if not impossible, to examine the history of British participation in the Second World War without looking at the First World War backgrounds of the senior generals. Slim never served on the Western Front, neither did Auchinleck. And that, I think, is a very important factor in their development, in their military development. Slim served in Gallipoli, badly wounded there, finagled himself back onto the active list, served in Mesopotamia, was wounded there again, shipped to India for rehab, and stayed in India in effect for the rest of his career, transferring from the West India Regiment of the British Army to the Indian Army, the 6th Gurkhas, shortly after the war. Auchinleck was a career Indian Army officer. The fact that neither of them served on the Western Front meant that there were different factors bearing on their development as soldiers. A very distinguished Indian Army general, the Second World War, Lieutenant General Sir Francis Tucker, in a letter to Slim's biographer, Ronald Lewin, in 1958, summed up Montgomery this way: Monty was a 1918 general and never moved beyond that. Whether or not you agree with Tucker's assessment, it does underscore how important the experience of service on the Western Front was to the overwhelming majority of British generals in the Second World War. Slim's background, Auchinleck's background was rather different. Slim began his splendid memoir, Defeat into Victory, with his appointment in March 1942 to command Burma Corps. But there was a whole history of professional military development that preceded that moment. And the most important part of it seems to have occurred in Mesopotamia. Slim never wrote anything about his experience in Mesopotamia, at least ostensibly, but he wrote a lot of short essays, fictionalized biography in a number of cases, which were pulled together in a little book called Unofficial History. A bit hard to lay one's hands on now, but very much worth reading. And one of the things that Slim says in Unofficial History, where he abandons for a moment the voice of the writer of light fiction, is a comment on something that happened in late 1916, 1917 in Mesopotamia, when the much tried and badly battered Mesopotamian Expeditionary Force was reorganized by Lieutenant General Sir Stanley Maude, who would then lead it to victory in 1917, the taking Baghdad. And Slim says in one of those short, ostensibly fictional pieces, it was what an enthralling experience it was for him as a young officer to see a badly battered and previously ill-led army recovering its strength and morale and urge to victory. And what Maude did for the Mesopotamian Expeditionary Force, of course, is what Slim would do a quarter of a century later in Burma. So for those interested in Slim's career, in addition to Ronald Lewin's splendid biography, I would really urge you to find a copy of Unofficial History and read what Slim wrote about service in Mesopotamia in the First World War. He also wrote a couple of very interesting essays on his early experience in the Second World War as a brigade commander in the first clashes between British and Italian forces on the border between the Sudan and Ethiopia, and as a division commander in the campaign to take Vichy ruled Syria. The Ethiopian story is called It Pays to Be, the Ethiopian story is called An Option of Difficulties, in which he says, and his brigade failed to take its objective. And in summing it up, he says, there were two choices open to me, and I chose the safer. Slim never had to learn a lesson twice. His command of 14th Army was full of risky choices, which turned into smashing victories. The essay on Syria is entitled It Pays to Be Bold, in which he describes how he gathered together the logistic support necessary to achieve his objective by basically stealing the gasoline supplies from units behind him all the way back from his position to Baghdad, and pulling off a remarkable victory. In 1945, in what was officially called extended capital and unofficially see or bust, Slim would do what he had done as a division commander in Syria on a very, very large scale, when he would simply abandon his overland communications and depend upon aerial resupply to move his army forward from central Burma to the capture of Rangoon. Technically, Rangoon fell to a seaborne assault. Slim's spearheads had been bogged down by early monsoon rains a few miles north of the capital, but fundamentally, it was Slim's offensive, which was logistically incredibly risky, that levered the Japanese out of Rangoon. And I might add, the sort of offensive that Montgomery would never, ever have considered mounting. About Auchinleck, I would say only a few things. Auchinleck never wrote a memoir. He commissioned someone to write an official biography, John Connell, who produced an 800 and some page book in the mid-1950s, which focused almost exclusively on Auchinleck's time as the Commander-in-Chief Middle East in 1941, 42. And in doing so, rather cast into the shade what Auchinleck, I think, really deserves to be remembered for. Auchinleck became, after a career which was marked for advancement from his time in Mesopotamia, where he learned the immense importance of not doing something until you're ready to do it. His unit, for a Punjab infantry battalion, the 1st Punjab, in its first battle in Mesopotamia, lost 50% of its strength, Somme-level casualties. After the second battle, it was down to about 20% of its strength. In 1940, he would write to the chief of the Imperial General Staff, by which time he was the Lieutenant General, that he had no intention of ever carrying out an operation for which he did not feel the preparation was sound enough to offer a good chance of success. Mesopotamia would mark Claude Auchinleck's approach to battle for the rest of his career. But perhaps the most important thing that Auchinleck did as commander-in-chief in India, and he had 2 tours that he became commander-in-chief in January 1941, was commander-in-chief for 159 days until Churchill moved him to Cairo as commander-in-chief Middle East, and then came back in June 1943 to be commander-in-chief and the last commander-in-chief of the old British Indian Army. Auchinleck had formed the opinion in the 1930s, that the very slow process, which had been inaugurated in the late 1920s, of granting full officer commissions to Indians, was moving much too slowly. And he realized in early 1941 that to build the sort of Indian army in size that London was demanding, there would be no choice, not only about the pace at which Indians were commissioned, but on the circumstances that surrounded commissioned Indian officers. It was summed up in a brief phrase: no distinction regardless of color. The process of what was called Indianization, commissioning Indians, had crept forward at a snail's pace in the 1920s and early 1930s, accelerated a little bit in the later 1930s. But there was no doubt that it was being done with all deliberate speed, to borrow a phrase from American jurisprudence. The date at which the Indian Army was expected on the eve of the Second World War to be fully staffed by Indian officers top to bottom was 1967. Auchinleck basically tore that up. He, in fact, dropped the name Indianization and substituted nationalization, ruled that Indian officers should be treated exactly as British officers were. They were officers in every respect, period. And when he came back in 1943, he pushed that forward very hard. He also pushed forward very hard the sweeping reorganization and retraining of the Army, which was being supervised by Reginald Savory, about whom you will hear something from Alan in a few minutes. Basically, Auchinleck seems to have had a real sense that the sands were running out in India for the British, and that what his generation of Indian Army officers could do for the institution to which they had given their lives was to see that it was in shape to be handed over in the best possible way. When Connell wrote the official biography of Auchinleck in the 1950s, he rather scanted this, partly because I think he was fixated on the Desert War against Rommel, in which Auchinleck had played a considerable role, and a much more successful role than was recognized at that time. But also because there were sensitivities, I think, political and cultural, in the 1950s that have largely evaporated now. And I think Auchinleck deserves a new biography which treats with care and comprehensiveness his time as the last commander-in-chief of the Indian Army. When the war ended, Auchinleck was very clear that the handover of power in India was coming soon. He told a room full of senior Indian Army officers at that stage, most of them still British, bluntly, "We are to go," and told them that their job was to see that they prepared the Army for transition. And then came Mountbatten. Another reason I think Connell may have danced rather lightly over Auchinleck's years in India, particularly at the end of the Raj, was that, of course, Dicky Mountbatten was still very much alive when he wrote. When the possibility of partitioning India, and therefore of partitioning the army, first became a live topic in 1945-46, Auchinleck's staff thought it would take 5 years to do it smoothly. By 1946-47, they had worked out plans that reduced the amount of time they would need to a year. Auchinleck actually had 8 weeks. And one of the long neglected until Dan Marston, who was my co-author on the book that received the Templar Prize, investigated in his book on the Indian Army and the end of the Raj. But one of the most remarkable feats of military administrative skill is the fact that the Indian Army was divided up in 8 weeks. Not a year, not 5 years. And it was divided up at a time when the need for what was called aid to the civil, about which Slim wrote an essay in Unofficial History, incidentally, at a time when the Army as an institution was under tremendous stress. It was dividing itself in two. It was subject to all of the communal tensions and anxieties, which produced the quite colossal scale of violence in North India in 1947. That all of this happened and the Army remained throughout a functioning and cohesive institution. There was a Sherlock Holmes story in which the key element was that the dog did not bark in the night. In the story of partition, one of the key elements is that the Indian Army, nearly 400,000 well-trained, well-armed soldiers, didn't break into splinters and start shooting at one another. Because as bad as the violence in North India was in the summer and early fall of 1947, it would have been orders of magnitude worse had the Army cracked. And in fact, the Army never did, owed a great deal to its own traditions, to the leadership of everyone, from subalterns to field marshals. But to a large degree, it owed its continued cohesion in circumstances of enormous stress and difficulty to Claude Auchinleck. He is largely forgotten now. He spent the last years of a long retirement in Morocco. He is buried in a cemetery in Casablanca. The only major biography of him is now well over 50 years old. And I would hope that somewhere somebody is contemplating a new study of him, because he is truly a forgotten man, not only of the Second World War, but much more importantly, I think, of the last days of British rule in India. And with that, I will pass the baton to my friend and colleague, Alan Jeffries.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Ray. So I'm going to talk about Reginald Savory, whose voluminous papers are held at the National Army Museum in London, where I work. And equally, he is very much a forgotten Indian Army general of the Second World War. And I've subtitled the section in the book, The Trainer, because his role in training the infantry in India during the Second World War, particularly 43 till 45, is absolutely essential for the campaign in Burma. So like Bill Slim, Savory served in the Gallipoli campaign with the 14th Sikhs. His regiment was decimated in the Third Battle of Krithia. I think only 2 officers weren't casualties and 47 Sikh soldiers. Savory himself was hit, and he was rescued by the regimental wrestler Uda Singh. So he was lucky to survive the battle. And even when Savory was adjutant general in 1946-47 in India, he said to his secretary, if uh, an Indian officer comes in, doesn't matter what meeting I'm in, send him straight in. Because he was so grateful for saving his life. And there's entries in Savory's diary saying, saw Uda Singh last night, gave him a good feed. So he keeps in touch with Uda Singh throughout his career, after in retirement, and also with his family after Uda Singh dies. And coming back to Savory and Gallipoli, he said, and this is after the campaign, he says, by God, if we had one World War II brigadier in Solva Bay, we would have got Gallipoli without the slightest trouble at all. The implication being that senior officers were more tactically aware and better trained during the Second World War. I think Savory epitomizes this. Like Auchinleck, the Auk, and Slim, that he's also served in Mesopotamia during the First World War, and served his regiment in Iraq, India, and the Northwest frontier during the interwar period. Savory briefly taught at the Indian Army School of Education and was one of the first officers to instruct at the Indian Military Academy in the early 1930s. And he later commented, and I quote, "The Indian wing of the Army School of Education was as important a milestone in the development of the Indian Army as the Indian Military Academy was later to become, possibly even more so." And certainly at the academy, when he talked to the academy, he says later on that it was the first time he came across the Indian middle class. And he was extremely proud of his role as an instructor there, because how important it was for the development of the army, up until the Second World War, but also post-independence. And he kept in touch with a lot of the officers that he instructed. He commanded his battalion in the late 1930s, and was a brigade commander in North Africa, and as well as East Africa. And he's one of a generation of Indian Army officers who took their profession very seriously, who trained their units and formations during the interwar and Second World War to a very high standard and very effectively commanded their formations. So he's called back to India and was given command of 23rd Indian Division. And on the 20th of May, 1942, he took over command of the front with the objective of preventing the Japanese invading India on the Imphal-Johor line and to defeat them if they tried to do so. However, the division was very short of equipment, with one of the battalions, for example, the 1st Assam Regiment, who served in the 1st Indian Infantry Brigade. They had no steel helmets, no respirators, and were short of about 40 bayonets. Similarly, the brigade had its full complement of Thompson submachine guns, Bren guns, and mortars, but had undertaken no training in their use. Savory was insistent on intensive training of his new division. He wrote to his wife, and I quote, "I'm training my division to be as hard as nails and to need no luxuries." And Savory was not afraid to relieve his brigade commanders. So the brigade commander of 1st Indian Infantry Brigade was a chap called Brigadier Francis Woodhouse. And Savory wrote in his adverse confidential report, and I quote, "This officer sits too much in his office and seldom visits the troops. He has not a well-developed tactical sense, and in my opinion is not a good trainer, though I admit the opportunities for training during the past year have been few." That's rather unusually. Savory sacks Woodhouse, not for his operational experience, but for his training abilities. Towards the end of his tenure as a divisional commanding officer, Savory wrote up his thoughts on jungle warfare. He foresaw a need for an increase in infantry, particularly, and I quote, "if we accept that jungle warfare is an infantry war." He did not discount the role of artillery in the jungle, but noted, for example, the slow movement of mountain artillery, such as the use of 3.7-inch howitzers, being terribly expensive in mules and personnel. Savory suggested the role of howitzers could be undertaken by 3-inch mortars, and as a result, he made sure that there was a high standard of training in 3-inch mortars within his division. He'd clearly thought about the difficulties of jungle warfare and fighting the Imperial Japanese Army in his time in command. This introspective assessment was not necessarily the norm across all British and Commonwealth divisional commanders. On the 11th of June 1943, Savory was appointed Inspector of Infantry. He was instrumental in the transformation of the Indian Army after the disastrous campaigns in Malaya, the retreat from Burma, and the First Arakan. He wrote to his wife, saying that the job, and I quote, is at GHQ, so I'll be at the centre of things, which will be a change after 3 years as a frontline soldier. It does not mean promotion, but in some respects a step forward. Over the next couple of years, Savory travelled widely around India. And he wrote in a letter to my friend and co-author, Ray, he said, I spent most of my time not only visiting the training establishments, but also infantry units across India. I also made regular trips to the front, so as to acquaint myself with conditions of the time and apply the lessons learnt. Within a few months, Savory became Director of Infantry with his own small directorate. And his remit was extended to include infantry organisation, equipment and arms. And he remained in this important role for a couple of years. And as Ray has pointed out in his seminal work, Churchill and His Generals, for the first time, the senior officers and divisional commanders, such as Auchinleck and Slim, you've heard about, and also Savory, were all largely drawn from the Indian Army and thus understood the traditions and ways of that particular army. So Savory's expanded role included advising GHQ on all infantry matters and to oversee the general interests of the infantry. He made detailed notes of his tours, and as a result of his first 2 tours, he noticed there was a lack of instructors at the schools, both in quality and quantity, even though training establishments were expanding. So one of his proposed solutions was to cut the number of schools, or at the very least, stop them overlapping. So, for example, he considered closing the Jungle Warfare School at Savory, where he was unimpressed by the British non-commissioned officers teaching there. Furthermore, he noted that after an all-day march, the majority of officers fell short. He was concerned whether it was up to the same standard as its sister school, the Jungle Warfare School Shimoga. And ultimately, his concerns proved correct, as during 1944, the Jungle Warfare School at Shimoga continued to train most of the officers and non-commissioned officers in jungle warfare, whereas the one at Savory closed in March 1944. As a result of Savory's hard work and lobbying, his staff grew. He wrote to his wife in October 1943, and I quote, "My responsibilities continue to increase, and the work with it. I have had to be given a bigger staff, but I keep all paperwork down to the absolute minimum." The expansion included an appointment of a deputy director who was responsible for infantry weapons, equipment, and liaison letters. And by 1944, he had four further staff officers in his directorate. So with this increased staff, the first infantry liaison letter was issued in December 1943 and distributed to all training establishments across India. They were also sent further afield to the War Office in the UK and the equivalent institutions in the US and Australia. There was a threefold purpose to these letters: to provide the infantry with short accounts of recent operations so that lessons could be learnt, to keep the infantry up to date with current developments in organisation, weapons, equipment, and to discuss all matters relevant to the infantry. The plan was to issue the letters monthly down to battalion level with the intention they would be disseminated further down the chain of command. And the letters were divided in 5 main sections on operations, organisation, weapons, equipment, and miscellaneous. So, for example, the weapons section discussed the requirement for infantry support in the jungle with mortar firepower, something that Savory had learnt with his time in 23rd Indian Division. So as a result, a strengthened base plate and a new sight was produced for the 3-inch mortar, which increased the range from 1,600 to 2,570 yards. And by March 1944, the mortars with strengthened base plates had been issued to all units in the 14th Army. So by April 1944, when Infantry Liaison Letter number 6 was produced, it was widely agreed there was now too many training pamphlets. So Scott Gilmore, who served with the 4th 8th Gurkha Rifles, remarked in his excellent memoir, A Connecticut Yankee in the 8th Gurkha Rifles, and I quote, "We read the manuals, which by now were thick on the table, packed with advice from 2 years of campaigning in Burma and the Pacific." The letter, Infantry Liaison Letter number 6 stated that now a common doctrine was essential and should be taught at all training establishments. And this came with Infantry Training 1944, produced by the War Office in the UK. But with the and that was standardized across all British and Indian infantry, whatever theatre they were fighting in. But this came along with the special application of the Jungle Book, which was produced in September, the 4th edition, September 1943. I don't have an example, but I do have an example of the 3rd edition, which was just called Jungle Warfare. So these training pamphlets were continually updated from 1940 all the way up to 1943. And the Jungle Book, produced in September 1943, was the first time that cartoons, pictures were used. This is and this was under the auspices of Auchinleck, to sort of popularize the training. And basically was the manual for training until the end of the war, in jungle warfare, alongside battle drill for thick jungle. And then this doctrine was continually updated from with the lessons learned through training memoranda. And this is an example of Army in India training memorandum. This one is actually an omnibus of on jungle warfare. So thus, there was now a common approach amongst all infantry across India for jungle warfare training. And then these everybody who undertook this training then went to jungle training divisions in India. Then they went to reinforcement camps where their training continued before they'd even joined their battalions in the Burma campaign. So it was absolutely essential for the Burma campaign. And so to sum up, as a divisional commander in Assam, Savory quickly realized that jungle warfare is primarily an infantry affair. As director of infantry, Savory made sure that infantry in India were manned, equipped, and trained to successfully reinforce the largely Indian Army-dominated 14th Army to defeat the Imperial Japanese Army in the campaigns in Northeast India and Burma during 1944 and 45. And to quote Savory for one last time, it was about the adaptation of lessons up, down, and sideways. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you, Alan and Raymond. That was really, really fascinating. I know we have a number of questions in the queue and a few hands raised, so I'll go to the queue and then I'll go to those with their hand raised. I know, Mike, I think you're there, and Alex, so just bear with us for a minute. First question from Richard. Can you discuss the similarities or differences between how Indian composed units were directed in the Mesopotamian Command in World War I and their analogs in East India and Burma in World War II? Was there any difference in the perspective of the Indian troops about where they were fighting or their belief in the morality of their British commanders?
I think a total answer, a complete answer to that question would be about 500 pages long. But here is my summary. The Indian units that went to war in 1914 were part of a long service, very professional army. It was an army that, due to the dominance of the martial races doctrine, was recruited heavily from North and Northwest India, particularly from the Punjab. And in many of these units, there was a sort of family feeling. Son followed father enlisting in the regiment. The glue that held the units together was the nature of their recruitment and an intermediate class of officers called Viceroy commissioned officers, for which there was no analog in any Western army. They were officers, but not on the same footing as King's commissioned officers, British officers. If you describe the system, it sounds like there ought to have been lots of jealousy that would have inhibited unit cohesion. But in fact, the system, as odd as it seems to us looking at it now, worked very, very well. The problem in Mesopotamia was that the pre-war regulars were very quickly decimated. Auchinleck's first Punjab went into its first battle in Mesopotamia, a badly conceived, badly planned battle, at full strength, and came out with better than half of its British officers and nearly a third of its VCOs casualties. And as the pre-war regular officer corps, both British and VCO, Indian, attenuated, unit cohesion was affected, unit effectiveness was affected. By the time of the Second World War, the system was still the same. King's commissioned officers, Viceroy commissioned officers, but the attenuation took place not because of, initially at least, because of battle casualties, but because of breakneck expansion. In June 1940, London told Delhi, expand the army as rapidly as you can and make it as large as you can. And what this meant was that the regular corps was stretched further and further and further. By the time a brigade of the 17th Indian Division, which was a third-tier expansion division, embarked for Singapore, where it was lost in 1942, there weren't a half dozen pre-war regular officers or VCOs, which meant that and many of the NCOs had been rapidly promoted and did not have the same, shall we say, bearing and stature that pre-war NCOs did. And all of this meant in the First World War that the units in Mesopotamia, until Maud reorganized things, that the units in Mesopotamia, although they never ceased to respond to orders to go forward, did so with less enthusiasm and greater clumsiness with each successive engagement as the pre-war regular cadre was diminished. The same thing happened for different reasons in the Second World War. The 9th and 11th Indian Divisions, which were lost in Malaya, were second wave expansion divisions. Hastily trained, wartime recruited officers, both British and Indian, hastily promoted VCOs, hastily promoted NCOs, inadequate equipment, inadequate training. The amazing thing is not that they were beaten by the Imperial Japanese Army, but in fact that they did as well as they did. The much tried 11th Indian Infantry Division hung together until it marched over the causeway onto Singapore Island. So I think that the lesson in both cases was that the And I think this would have been true, incidentally, of any comparably of any Western unit, British, American, Canadian, what have you, if the regular corps of the unit, its officers, there were no VCO equivalent in Western armies, but its officers and non-commissioned officers were as new and as hastily trained and as inexperienced. The United States Army initial commitment to battle against the Germans, Kasserine Pass, February 1943. A full-strength, lavishly equipped American armored division got sliced and diced in a couple of days by a battle group of the Afrika Korps, a unit about a third its size, because the American division had all of the equipment American factories could provide, but its officers, non-commissioned officers, were newly inducted, partially trained, and basically the professionals beat the amateurs. So I don't know whether that completely answers the question posed, but I think in both cases, what the lesson of Mespot, at least before Maud, the lesson the Second World War before 1942, 43, was that if you send units to battle led by people who are inexperienced and without enough of the right sort of equipment, and across the front line are something like the Imperial Japanese Army units of 1942 or the Afrika Korps, you're going to have your head handed to you.
Yeah,
Perfect.
I'm
Yeah,
just going to add
Alan,
a
please.
little tiny thing on that, because obviously they're both the big campaigns for the Indian Army, and one of the big differences, and Ray's pointed out in his books, is that the transformation in Mesopotamia is led by senior British Army officers, and the new CNC India, Charles Monroe, is a British service officer. So the big difference between the British Army and the Indian Army, whereas in the Second World War and the Burma campaign, all the senior officers are Indian Army.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Perfect. We'll take one more for the queue and then go to Mike and Alex. Gary asked, did Gandhi's pacifism encourage Indians to not fight with the British against the Japanese? And did some Indians actually join the Japanese when they attacked the Indian eastern border?
If I may, I might answer the first one, Ray, just to say that some senior Indian Army officers actually conferred with Gandhi about whether they should continue in the Indian Army. So General Rudra, he'd served in the Indian Army from the 1920s onwards, and he went to see Gandhi to see whether he should continue in the army. And Gandhi says, well, obviously we're going to need an army post-independence.
Yeah, I think that Gandhi's influence on the army, apart from individual cases like the one Alan just pointed out, really was very slight. In 1942, the famous Quit India movement, or the Congress Revolt, to deal, and of course, Gandhian pacifism was, as a number of Indian Army officers and Indian civil service officers often pointed out in the 20s and 30s, meant that while Mr. Gandhi didn't engage in violence, lots of his supporters did. In 1942, the Indian Army was at full stretch. It was full of recently recruited, incompletely trained Jawans. Its officer corps was full of recently commissioned and inexperienced among both British and Indian subalterns, captains. To deal with the disturbances set off by the August 1942 Quit India movement, something like 57 battalions of the Indian Army had to be deployed. There was only one full-strength British division in India at that moment, the 70th Division, which was part of Slim's 15th Corps and was training for jungle warfare. The Quit India movement was dealt with to the extent that troops were used by Indian soldiers, commanded by, in many cases, by recently commissioned Indian officers. And there was not a single case of disaffection among those units. And I think that proves two things. One is how wrong Winston Churchill was about the fundamental loyalty of the Indian Army, which was one of the tropes that he occasionally surfaced. And the second was that however much impact Gandhi had, and there's no doubt he had massive impact on the political evolution of India between 1920 and 1947, his actual impact inside the army was not as great as either some British officials feared it might be, or as some Indian nationalist leaders hoped it would be. So I've always, personal note, I've always thought that the perceptions of Gandhi that are held today in both Britain and the United States were affected far more by the bravura performance of the actor Ben Kingsley in that movie than by the reality of what actually happened on the ground.
That's interesting. Mike, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yes, thank you both for great and enlightening talk. I did read Slim's first book, Unauthorized biography, and a couple of the things that struck me about Slim, and this could be said, especially from other things that I've read, and from what you've said. I'm struck by the total absence, thankfully, of egotism, racism, and the need or even desire for self-promotion. And I think that the fact that none of the three that generals that you've been discussing suffered from that. I was wondering to what degree that affected them, or that served their purposes, or affected them obviously in how they wound up in history, but also affected them with London, and if also with the how that affected them with their troops. In other words, obviously they were dealing mainly with men on the level of lieutenant colonel and up, but even down to a lieutenant or the individual men, how that played out with their troops. I don't know if I've made that clear.
Oh yes, no, it's very clear. I would say, and I'm sure Alan will add to this, Slim was a very, very unusual character. Into a strata of British society that did not provide army officers. We would call it, I suppose, lower middle class, perhaps even the top tier of the working class. His father was not very successful. I was about to say hardware merchant. I think the British. And Slim got where he got, first of all, by being very good at what he did, but also being an extraordinarily talented worker of the system. I mean, he got a temporary commission in the Royal Warks in 1914, traded that for a permanent the least regarded regiment on the British Army list, and then transferred to the Indian Army. And at each stage in his career, he found a way to beat the system. The Royal Army Medical Corps told him nobody ever quite, particularly his superiors, ever quite figured out how he worked the hustle of, while listed as unfit for active service, winding up commanding a company in Mesopotamia. And I think that in the course of that career, he had a greater exposure to a cross sections not only of British society, but but he understood, and Gurkha regiments, of course, were a world of their own, still are. But he never lost touch with the fact that, as Wellington once said, when asked how he had won battles, he pointed to a sentry and said, "It all depends on that element there, the average soldier." And there's a very striking depiction of Slim in George MacDonald Fraser's memoir, Quartered Safe Out Here, where he talked about the fact that Slim visited his unit, and he said Slim had a force that came out of him that he had never encountered in anybody before or since. And when you consider in the Second World War, people had tried to sideline him at least twice, and in both cases, he took the job of the person trying to sideline him. Slim was just unusual from start to finish, I think. And he certainly did not come out of the sealed pattern of British officers the way, say, somebody like Alexander did. But let me pass it to Alan to talk about Savory.
Yeah, well, quite agree, Ray. I mean, so for Reginald Savory, what's fascinating about his papers, so it has all the official papers, but it also has all the letters to his parents, the letters to his wife. And there's a real lack of, there's no racism, very little self-promotion or egotism at all. And he comes across as extremely professional and quite likable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that's remarkable about Auchinleck, considering when he was born and what his background was, that Auchinleck took a look as by that time he had reached Major General, took a look at the scheme thought up for the Indianization, a term he killed when he was commander-in-chief, replaced it with nationalization. But the Indianization scheme that was put in place in the 1930s was called the Four Regiments Scheme. And 4 Indian Army regiments were picked for Indianization. When the first Indian King's commissioned officer was appointed to one of those units, no further British appointments would be made, so that the 4 units would become slowly Indian from bottom to top over a course of several decades. And Auchinleck spotted that as segregation. In fact, one nickname for these 4 units was Jim Crow regiments. And Auchinleck killed that stone dead the minute he became commander-in-chief. Auchinleck didn't talk a lot about racism, but he recognized the elements of it that were present. And he did his considerable best in those 2 tours as commander-in-chief to deal with it. He delivered a very interesting talk to senior officers of the army just shortly after the end of the Second World War. And he said bluntly in that talk that the reason for some of the pains and anxieties and difficulties were that British officers, and he added, and their wives, had behaved so poorly toward Indian officers when they began to appear in regimental life in the 1930s. So one final point. I recently looked again at a letter that Churchill wrote to John Curtin, who was then Prime Minister of Australia, in January 1942, describing the first defeats in northern Malaya of the 11th Indian Infantry Division. And Churchill reprinted this letter in his memoirs with an important and unacknowledged ellipsis, no 3 dots. And what Churchill wrote was, the Japanese successes are due to the fact that for the first couple of weeks, they had only 2 white battalions and some gunners facing them. And this is the part that he dropped out, the rest being Indian soldiers. That there was a streak of racism is just undeniable, as was the case in the United States Army as well. But the interesting thing about Auchinleck is he belonged to fundamentally the same generation as Churchill. And he came out of the same background as most Army officers of his generation. But when he reached the point of exercising authority in the 1930s and 40s, his attitudes were very different. And that part of that may be that Auchinleck came to regard India as his real home. He never really resettled in England after he retired.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Alex, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Yeah, so I had 2 questions. First, how did they deal with, Japanese propaganda to, especially with the Indian National Army out there in Bose, as 30,000 Indian soldiers that joined, yeah. And second, I wanted to ask about the 5th Indian Division. which Mountbatten had quite a bit of praise for. That was, I think, yeah, in Kohima and Imphal, but also served in Ethiopia and in North Africa, and so had, combat experience. So I was, yeah, curious how that division, was treated differently, and how that, yeah, combat experience from Africa wound up paying off later on. Thanks.
Uh, shall I say something about Fifth Indian Division, right? Is that right? Okay. So Fifth Indian Division, like you say, they serve in the Middle East, and they're very effective in the East African campaign. At the Battle of Keren seems never quite sure of the pronunciations. But one of the big differences there is you've got two Indian Army divisions fighting together, Fourth Indian and Fifth Indian.
Right, right.
And initially they're a bit unsuccessful. They train together, and then they're ultimately successful. And this is unusual in the North African campaign because the Indian divisions, because of perhaps the lack of political support, are broken up. So brigades end up fighting with different divisions. Divisions aren't kept together. I mean, the main division in North Africa is really Fourth Indian Division under General Tuka, who Ray just mentioned. And then obviously Fifth Indian get called back to India. They retrain under General Briggs and go on to fight in the Second Arakan campaign alongside 7th Indian Division, who is commanded by General Frank Messervy. Messervy has also served in North Africa and East Africa. In fact, one of the important things about the East African campaign that you get so many brigade commanders who serve in East Africa who go on to much higher levels.
Oh,
So a lot of brigade commanders like Savory, Briggs, Slim end up fighting in and Messervy as well, end up fighting in Burma and becoming, divisional commanders, corps commanders, army commanders.
hmm.
So it's a very important step in the development of the Indian Army, the East African campaign thing. And then to come back to Fifth Indian, so they retrain in India, retrain for jungle warfare. So they're a battle-hardened division, but they retrain for jungle warfare and go, as I say, go into the Second Arakan with 7th Indian Division. And initially they get used to the jungles through patrolling, and then with the first Japanese onslaught, one of the main things is alongside jungle warfare training for all troops, admin troops, and that kind of thing at the admin box, but also air supply. And then 5th Indian Division do end up fighting at Imphal and Kohima, and go on to fight throughout the Burma campaign. I'll leave it there because I could probably talk for hours about
Right,
individual
right, right,
divisions.
right.
But
Yeah, I
they're
think there's an
most
entire
impressive.
book on them
Yeah,
by
the
Brett
Ball of Fire.
James. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's a divisional, which is excellent, and certainly I think one of the most highly rated divisions is 4th Indian Division.
Mhm.
I remember reading somewhere that they were considered one of the best divisions, across British and Commonwealth divisions.
Yeah.
But there were so many good Indian Army divisions, especially in Burma, but previously as well. So perhaps I'll leave it there, Ray,
Right.
for
And
the
Alan,
moment.
any thoughts that they should have sent more Indian divisions, well, into Italy and so on?
So fourth, as you know, fourth does go into the Italian campaign, and then and they're fighting in northern Italy and get withdrawn to Greece, and then they make up the majority of the Punjab boundary force during partition, um, and then the two so 4th, 8th, and 10th Indian Divisions end up fighting in the Italian campaign as one Gurkha Lorry Brigade as well. And it has to be said in the later campaigns in 1945, the three divisions and the brigade are extremely effective, and in 45 a lot end up fighting together as well. 10th Indian Division actually takes over from 4th Indian. division in northern Italy. The most impressive, and one of the things that all divisions, Indian Army divisions do, and this is probably not the case, certainly isn't the case in the British Army, but in perhaps different from other armies as well, they produce training instructions, so they're continually learning the lessons from their fighting. And these training instructions come out. Tuka starts them, for example, in North Africa when he takes over command of 4th Indian Division. But they happen earlier. Even 9th Indian Division, Malaya, have training instructions. They are learning from their lessons. But obviously there's other issues that, like Ray mentioned, in Malaya. There's some very, very impressive Indian Army divisions across all theatres.
Perfect. Thanks, Alan.
I would just add that in North Africa, in the Middle East generally, until mid 1942, most of the divisions that are deployed there, either in the Western Desert or in Syria and Iraq, occupying Persia, they're Indian Army divisions. And the many of the other divisions deployed in the Middle East were Commonwealth divisions, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa. And the Commonwealth divisions had an unusual relationship with high command. They had the right to appeal to their home governments if they thought they received orders that would endanger them. And the only units that Wavell and later Auchinleck could freely dispose of were Indian Army units. And as Alan just said, that's led them often to be broken up and scattered about the desert in an almost random way. The First South African Division was commanded by a man named Daniel Pienaar, who had been a pre-war South African policeman. And Pienaar's attitude to orders were that he would obey them if he liked them. And during the retreat that ended at Alamein, he received orders to occupy an interim delaying position, and decided he didn't like the orders, so he simply ignored them. That was not an option open to Indian Army commanders.
And the issue of Japanese propaganda to entice Indian soldiers to defect and join the Indian National Army. I wonder what you guys think about that.
Well, the Indian National Army was regarded by the Imperial Japanese Army. And here I would mention to you the works of Edward Drea, D-R-E-A, who has written some of the best stuff on the Imperial Japanese Army. They were regarded with contempt. The Imperial Japanese Army didn't surrender. The INA was recruited from POW camps from people who had surrendered. And the Japanese never took them seriously except as a propaganda asset. I think there is virtually no evidence that the presence of INA units, either during the fall fighting or later in Arakan, had any appreciable effect at all on the Indian soldiers on the other side of the firing line. The INA became a significant factor after the war, when it was adopted by the Congress Party as basically as a club with which to beat the Raj. But I think despite there have been a number there have been lots of books about the INA, some of them trying very hard to demonstrate that it did have military effectiveness, but um, it simply didn't. Partly because the Japanese didn't treat it as a serious military asset. Whether had the Japanese regarded it differently, it might have performed differently. Another question, another issue.
Right. Well, thanks to you two for some excellent points.
Raymond and Alan, do you have time for one more, maybe? I know we're a bit over the clock here. Great. Aaron, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yes, no, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, loud and
Oh,
clear.
great. Thank you, Mr. Callahan and Mr. Jeffries. It's a phenomenal book and great talk today. My question is to follow up on the not directly on the Indian Army, but on the perception of the fifth column, we'll just call it, and what did the generals think of the approach of the British Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Center, the SISTIC, looking to try to identify those soldiers, which they classified as white or gray or black, not from a racial standpoint, but from if they're onside or offside, and whether they supported Bose or Hind, and what was their view of a post-war sort of British Indian Army? I mean, obviously history is the history we know happened, but did they perceive that the British Indian Raj would just sort of continue, or just be kind of a hybrid? I mean, what was your perception of how they viewed that, or did they even have a view on that? And once again, thank you so much for a fantastic book.
Alan?
Yeah, funny. INA is obviously any talker sort of always get questions about the INA. I mean, there's two incarnations. Like Ray said, the prisoners of war. So the initial incarnation of the INA is under Captain Mohan Singh, and he falls out with his Japanese paymasters. And so he goes into abeyance, and then obviously Chandra Bose takes over, comes over from Berlin, and he's a very popular Bengali politician, very keen on sort of military uniforms and that kind of thing. And I think, like Ray says, I remember I think it was the 7th Indian Division comes up against, I think it's the 2nd INA Division in crossing the Irrawaddy. And within 2 days, the INA have surrendered or run away. And I can only really agree, sort of flawed as a military force. As to the generals, I mean, certainly in Savory's papers, he is adjutant general in 46, 45. He doesn't honestly talk a lot about. He's very supportive of Auchinleck. And also at the same time in 45, you've got the Royal Indian Navy mutiny, which Savory does seem to have been involved in. And the army is sent in to sort of suppress the Indian naval mutiny or uprising, and that is down to relations between the Indian sailors and the British officers, and there's certainly elements of racism there for sure. And Savory's involved to an extent in that. And then at the same time, you also have the Air Force mutinies. There's a mutiny with the Royal Air Force, but also the Indian Air Force as well. And then with the trials of the 3 INA leaders that Auchinleck's very much involved in. I might leave that bit to you, Ray, actually, if you don't mind. But I agree with Ray. I mean, they're very much INA is very important as a political force, and many of them obviously aren't allowed to rejoin the army, and they get freedom fighter pensions later on, because obviously they're not getting their army pension. And perhaps I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, I think what I would say is the existence of the INA was a matter of concern, of course, at Indian Army headquarters. And they paid a lot of attention to, they gathered every scrap of information they could about it during the war, because there was always a concern about the impact that it might have. But I think a combination of fundamental disdain on the part of the Imperial Japanese Army toward it, and the fact that the Indian Army's, I guess the word would be renaissance in 1943, and the fact that from that point on, they were winning. All of this tended to mute whatever impact it might have had. In fact, there is certainly some evidence that Indian Army soldiers were not particularly enthusiastic about accepting the surrender of INA soldiers. As for post-war, it presented a huge problem for Auchinleck, because on the one hand, the Congress Party was working overtime to turn the INA into heroes of Indian national resistance to the British Raj. And on the other hand, what Auchinleck had to consider was the maintenance of the traditions of loyalty and obedience to the chain of command, which were essential not only to the Indian Army, but to any army. And I think that while you can certainly critique this or that decision he took about the INA trials, the question I've always asked myself when considering it is, what other realistic option was there for him? He couldn't very well say, well, we'll just forget all of this and we'll discharge them without a pension and forget it. Because after all, the majority of Indian POWs didn't join the INA, despite tremendous pressure and in many cases very considerable maltreatment to get them to do so. Most of the INA that Bose presided over was recruited not from Indian POWs, but from the resident Indian population in Malaya, who were from southern India, Tamils who had migrated there to work on the rubber plantations. So the Auchinleck was in a position where he had to do something. And what he decided to do was essentially 3 symbolic court martials, because everyone knew that the death penalty, that these people would be found guilty, that was obvious, but the death penalty wouldn't be applied. In fact, they got dishonorable discharges in effect. So I think my answer to the question was, yes, the Indian Army worried a lot about it during the war, and they worked very hard to collect information on it. And I believe, and I've lost the name of the person involved, but I believe somebody is writing a book about the work of the Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Center, SISTIC. and I apologize for not remembering the name of the person working on it. But that after the war, the INA becomes a significant issue because of the attitude toward it embraced by mostly by the Congress Party. The Muslim League kept largely quiet on the issue. And as Auchinleck said at the time in some of his letters, the maintenance of the tradition of loyalty and obedience would be important to the new Indian government to which the British would hand over. And that seems to have been a point that, at least at the time, largely escaped Nehru and Gandhi.
One other quick follow-up. Did either of you read Toy's The Springing Tiger? And if you did, what did you think of it? I mean, as a sub amateur, I viewed it a certain way, but I'd love to have your opinion of it.
I must admit I have not looked at it in a long time. I did look at it a long time ago when I first was working on Burma. I think there's no doubt that some of the people involved in the first INA did so for reasons that we could describe as idealistic. They believed in an independent India. They thought this was a step in that direction. But the first INA, as Alan pointed out, petered out. Mohan Singh fell out with the Japanese High Command, and it was pretty much a moribund organization when the Germans exported bows to the Far East. And I think the second INA may have included a few people who really did believe they were fighting for the future freedom of India. But the fact was that by 1943-44, everybody responsible for the government of the Raj knew that independence was coming soon after victory. Auchinleck certainly knew it. In fact, probably the only person in the British High Command who didn't know it was Winston Churchill. In as late as 1945, when Wavell was in London trying to persuade the new Labour government of some of the realities in India, he visited Churchill, who was out of office by that time, living in a hotel. And as Churchill bade goodbye to Wavell, he said to him, "Keep a bit of India." At that point, he may have been the only person who thought it was going to be possible to keep a bit of India. In a way, the INA was pushing at a door which was already swinging open.
Great, thanks, Aaron. And that concludes our lecture for today. I want to thank our speakers for a great lecture and Q&A. The book is Churchill's Forgotten Generals, Victors in Burma by Raymond Callahan and Alan Jeffries. Please join us next Saturday, August 8th at 1 p.m. when historian John Wilson will discuss his book, Out of Chaos, How the Nation State Emerged from the Ruins of World War II, which argues that the nation state emerged suddenly and unexpectedly in the years following World War II and brought order to a world in a crisis. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We look forward to see you next week, and special thanks to our speakers for joining us. Thank you, Raymond Allen. That was a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you.